Okay, good evening, everybody. My name is Jenny. I do events here at the Country Club, and thank you so much for taking time out of your busy evening to spend it with us here. We have a very special presentation tonight. We have the Portage County Historical Society joining us this evening. And as you know, we turn 100 years old this year, so we have a few extra events that are special planned for this year. Don't forget that we have a huge 100-year celebration on August 16th, so make sure that you have that on your calendar now, and then just continue to watch your email communication for more information, and then the sign-up that goes to that. We're also putting together a really cool video. Melissa Blinker is heading that up. If you're willing to share some memories from the club, she's actually recording people doing interviews tonight. So I did print off some sheets with her excellent questions. If you just want to review those, give them a little preview before you share your thoughts with Melissa tonight. So if you're willing to do that, find her after the presentation. So we are very lucky to have the Portage County Historical Society with us. If you don't know what this group does, through preservation and education, they present resources, exhibits, and programming that cover a wide variety of history in our county. They also care for 14 historical sites in our area, so that's pretty cool. So Cheyenne Antell, a curator at the Portage County Historical Society, will be giving a half-hour-ish presentation tonight on our club's history and kind of explain the role that we have played in our community's culture. She will explain more in depth, but she spends hours and hours researching our club's history and found lots of good stuff. So she will share just some of that with us tonight. Also a special thanks to Cole Racine, who's out here recording. He's done a lot of help as well with the history of our club. But before Cheyenne, I want to welcome Portage County Historical Director John Harry.
Thank you all for coming here tonight. I wasn't actually planning on talking, but I have to talk to you tonight because I have big news. And that is that the Wisconsin State Historical Society gives out an award every year to the top historical society in the state called the Reuben Goldthwait's Trophy. And I wouldn't be talking to you about it if we didn't just win it. Thank you all, for people who've been involved with us for a while, thank you so much for supporting us. And for those of you who can't, wouldn't you like to be more involved with an award-winning organization? We do have a lot going up. Oop, this thing is coming in and out. There we go. We do have a lot. Hello? Okay. We do have a lot coming up this month. And so if you're not on the mailing list, please get on the mailing list. On July 15th, we have a concert coming up at the Rising Star Mill with a Chicago blues guitar player and singer named Jeff Massey. We also, on the 23rd of July, in conjunction with our music our exhibit on music history, we are kicking off a live oral history series where we will be talking with people who've made history in our community. That is on the 23rd. The first guy is named Bob Ray. You might have grown up with him around here. He went down to Alabama to Muscle Shoals to record with Ray Charles and Johnny Cash and Hank Williams Jr. and all sorts of people. So you can hear straight from him on the 23rd. And then on the 30th at the university, we're hosting a talk with the Packers team historian. Because I don't know if you know that the Packers training camps used to be held in Stevens Point in the 50s. They were really bad in the 50s. So, anyway, but we have that coming up, so we hope to see you again. And with a different microphone is Cheyenne Antell.
Yeah. Well, thank you. So, like John just said, I'm Cheyenne Antell. I'm the curator here at the Portage County Historical Society, and I get the joy of talking with you today about the history of the Stevens Point Country Club. Now, I know a lot of you, especially if you're members of the club, you are probably going to be interested in more history than what I have for you tonight. So if you are curious to learn more about one tournament that was held here, the Point Special Open Tournament held by Point Brewing, we already have a blog post up about that written by John Harry, so you can visit our website to read about that tournament. And later this summer, I found so much about women's golfing history and tournament history here that I'm going to be writing another blog post on those topics. So keep your eyes open for that later. But for now, we're going to look at a century on the green, the history of our Stevens Point Country Club. So we're going to be focusing on sort of 3 areas tonight. We're going to start by answering the question of how did this country club form? There were a lot of golf events and clubs starting in the 1920s, so we're going to look at what forces really pushed this one to begin. Then we'll look at the first decades. Of course, that's what's going to make or break a club, and ours made it. So what were those changes? What did the first pro, Bobby DeGuire, do out here that allowed us to succeed? What were big changes to the course or the clubhouse? And what was the payoff? And finally, we'll look at some of the continued growth and renovations since those early decades. Of course, it's tough to cover 100 years in 30 minutes, but we'll see what we can do. Now, it's worth mentioning, we are not the only golf course in the area, nor were we the first, but we are the best. So in 1899, the Wausau Country Club began. They were the first in our area. And it's really interesting that for 20 years, you really didn't have golf in our Wisconsin Valley south of Wausau. People, whether they were in Marshfield or Wisconsin Rapids or Stevens Point, you were traveling to Wausau or you were finding a very small community-run course. There were rumors that we had a small golf course near the downtown area in the early 1900s, but there's been no proof of it on maps, so that's still a bit of a mystery. But after Wausau opened, there was about a 20-year gap where everyone was just traveling to the one main country club and course. Then Bullseye over in Wisconsin Rapids, they opened in 1922, Marshfield opened in 23, and that's when Stevens Point started planning for our country club, which officially opened in 1928, but really the newspaper articles started a bit before. It's also worth mentioning that we are not the only golf course that's here in town. Later decades brought changes to the golf game in Stevens Point, with the Wisconsin River Golf Club opening in 1959 and Century World opening in 1982. Together, those 3 courses have really changed the way golf happens in our central Wisconsin Valley. Now, that Wisconsin River golf course location is actually a little historic. In 1920, there were considerations to open a 3-cities country club on that site or in the Meehan area. The idea was that if you had Wisconsin Rapids and Marshfield and Point work together, we could for sure get enough money to have a golf course south of Wausau. The tough part is, where do you put it? People in Marshfield wanted it by them, Rapids of course wanted it by them, and if we had it on our side of the Wisconsin River, it made it tougher for those communities to come over. So after about 2 years of considering where it could open, Wisconsin Rapids just opened their own first, and that sort of destroyed the whole thing. Once they opened, Marshfield jumped on and opened theirs, and we were left with a few years of our golfers heading to other communities. And that kind of ticked some of them off. We have the community for the golfers. We just need the land and the course to support them. So starting in 1922 was the first meeting of enthusiasts who wanted a Stevens Point-based country club. Stop having to drive, stop having to go around. And they argued, it's believed there's at least 25 men who would golf here if we had a course. I'm sure they get more than 25 men out here in an hour now. But at the time, that was what they were looking for. In 1925 is when they started looking at properties. We'll look at some maps soon. But they ended up debating a few properties around in this Plover Hills location because, as many of you golfers would know, the sandy area of this area of Plover Hills right along the river is fantastic for golf grass. So here's some of those maps like I was talking about. This is one of the earliest maps we can find of our area. It's 1876. And what I love about comparing these old maps is you can see how the land got sold and sold and sold, and the parcels kept getting smaller. So back in 1876, we had these big groups of land owned by local families. To help orient you, here is that Wisconsin Central Railroad line. Here's the river that would be going through what is today Iverson. And up here is what would become Highway 18 and later Highway 10. So we're looking at this area here becoming what is today the Stevens Point Country Club. As the area developed, as the highway came in and the city started having to buy more of this land, which was farmland, as you can see in this 1876 map, there's a mill right here, sort of at the juncture of the river and the road. So we know that a lot of the trees around here had already been cut down, and we were using these as fields. Later, this farmland had been sold to more and more small families until eventually the Loss family and the Danelski family sold their land to the Stevens Point Country Club. They ended up selling what you can see here on this 1949 map is right what we have now. So you still have the village of Park Ridge owning Iverson, you have that Highway 10 up top and the Central Wisconsin Railroad here, but this land used to be farmland. What was fun is once they started turning this into a golf course, they actually had to bring out some professors from UWSP, which was then the Central State Teachers College, because they couldn't understand what bugs they were dealing with. And it turns out they had bugs that specifically targeted rye fields or fields of corn that were coming out here and now attacking the grass on the course. Thankfully, we were not growing rye here on the course, so it didn't take them too long to die out. But it was fun to see that, some parts of that agriculture lived on. Another way that this course stayed tied to agriculture or to farming or other nature groups is with its connection to the Isaac Walton League. If you haven't heard about the Isaac Walton League, it's a national level organization. You might think of it as like a DNR that was focused very heavily on preserving fishing habitats and hunting habitats. They realized that we were exploiting natural resources much faster than they could be re-upped by the natural population. So as far back as 1902, there was a fishing and hunting club here in Stevens Point that was formed because they were concerned that we were depleting the local stock. In fact, in the Stevens Point Journal, they said, a person who wishes to may, on almost any evening, leave and go either up and down the river and see men spearing the fish. Dynamiting them is also common. You certainly get the fish you want, but quite a few you don't. So this group started pushing for more catch and release, not dynamiting a riverbed to get fish, and wanting to rebuild these habitats that were being destroyed. In 1923, that national organization, the Isaac Walton League, was formed, and by 1924, our group had officially joined that league. That gave them a lot of power when it came to pushing for state and national level change. And they were able to push using Stevens Point and our watershed as an example of why we needed the help. Now, it is a little confusing on how this might fit into golf, but I promise it comes back. We have an amazing area of our course here that you're following right along the river, and you have a lot of natural area. Back in 1926, there was the idea by the Isaac Walton League that you should start maybe a fish hatchery here, or rearing the fish in some sort of trout ponds, something so that you can start reseeding these areas with new fish. The problem was they realized that even after, in 1924, they put 200,000 minnows of different fish types in local waterways. They found that the minnows didn't survive. Almost 75% of them would die before they reached maturity. But if you raise the fish in captivity first and release them when they're larger, that's when they have a better chance. So starting in 1927, there started to be fundraising to build trout pools so that we could rear trout. And that ended up being here on the Stevens Point Country Club golf course. So the first trout were delivered here in 1927, and I think I figured out how we got this land here. Mr. Rotruba was in the Isaac Walton League, but was also the first secretary for the Stevens Point Country Club. So he was able to look at the needs of both of these organizations, and he realized where we border the river already, that golf area was staying marshy and staying wet. And so the golf course was already considering building some sort of drainage pond. He said, why not do both? You build the pond, we're gonna stock it with trout. So in 1927 was their first delivery of 10,000 trout. They would be raising them up to about 5 or 6 inches in length before bringing them out. But in some future years, they went up to multiple hundreds, thousands of these minnows that were coming through. Sadly, by about 1930, they stopped using the pool, but the water remains. It still works as a drainage pond for us. So the next time you're golfing the course and you hit the lovely water features, you can consider that any of the fish still living in there might be the descendants of these nice trout. Now, fundraising for anything, whether it's trout or a golf course, is difficult. And there was a time when the country club was really struggling to make the last few $1,000s. They were close, but they couldn't get permission to start building or purchasing land until they reached a certain line. In 1926, the vice president of the country club, who was Margaret Clifford, she also worked at the Whiting Plover Paper Company, and she was able to get George Whiting to fund $5,000 in stock. So he bought this stock in the company, which was enough to push us over the line. Another one of the board members here at Stevens Point Country Club, E.A. Oberweiser, he also worked there and held $1,000 of stock here. So because the two members held so much stock and had really helped fund this club, that's why you so often see this referred to as the Whiting Country Club. It was named in their honor. Now, even then, you would see some news articles saying Whiting, some saying Stevens Point, but the honor and the work that people like George Whiting did for this area still lives on through their memories. You might wonder, how much did it actually cost to start this club? How much were they fundraising for? And in that first year, this is what they were looking for. The first year, they paid $6,191.56 to build the 9 holes. This is what they needed. This was for buying the land. This was for paying for hotel bills for the people who were coming to stay. This was for getting the first rounds of fertilizer, hiring an architect to design the holes. In 2025 money, that was $114,000. So really, that $5,000 really came in handy. Now, there was the warning of, if you want to make this an 18-hole course, how much more would you need? Even a year or so after opening, people wanted a full course here. If they were going to finish the course, including adding water systems, adding more grass seed, getting the labor in, they were thinking it would need to be close to $10,000, which of course in that time was a lot. And it's part of the reason why we didn't get that second 9 for quite some time. If you ever wondered what the first golf schedule here looked like, this was the first tournament schedule in 1928. They started with a lot of just different mixes, foursomes, plays, mixing up the groups. One thing they started in 28 that they would continue for decades would be meal tournaments. So either you get breakfast and then you go on the course, or when you finish the course, you come in for dinner. Those were really popular, and the clubhouse, understandably, enjoyed the extra revenue as well. So this is our first year. And the next year, in 1929, what was interesting is they started adding fun tournaments, things that maybe only popped up for a year or two, but still had a really fun impact on the members. So for example, their first opening tournament on May 11th was a noise and obstacle tournament. The groundskeepers set up obstacles, and if your twosome was paired with someone else and they were teeing off, you were encouraged to give them advice. Why not tell them how to golf? And if you could make some noise, maybe rattle your clubs, that would be great. I am sure there were some foursomes that didn't speak to each other for a little bit after that one. Quite a few of the other tournaments in the future years started to be sponsored by businesses. So you might have the Wysocki Family Farm Cup, or the Nigbur Fine Furs Cup. These were different groups that were able to fund the country club, but also get a little promotion on their side as well. Now, the first pro who was here, he had a really nice quote. This is Bobby DeGuire. So in 1929, he was trying to convince people, you don't need to be perfect to be in a tournament. So he said, tournaments aren't held for the good golfers of the club. They're for every member, good player or not. Just because a person can't play as good as Charlie Nelson, or because he can't make the water hole in par, he shouldn't stay out of tournaments. They should join and have a good time so that everyone will be better acquainted and be better golfers. So if you've been holding out on not joining a tournament, Bobby DeGuire would tell you to do it. Now, more about Bobby DeGuire. He grew up in Appleton. And actually at the age of 15, he started teaching golf at their Riverview Club there. He was one of the assistant pros. He won tournaments as a caddy. There were certain tournaments that if you were a younger caddy member, only you could play. He won some of those out in the Appleton area. And later, he was hired as the first pro at the Bullseye Golf Course out in Wisconsin Rapids. So we stole him, of course. And we got him here in 1927. He stayed until 1942, and the entire time spent his career making sure we won over Wisconsin Rapids. Anytime there was a tournament. In fact, in 1929, 2 years after he started talking a little bit of smack. He was recorded in the newspaper saying, of course this year is going to be good, and it goes without saying that we will beat Wisconsin Rapids, who had just gotten a new golf pro, so they were feeling a little touchy. And it turns out he did. They went to the tournament, and the two pros played head versus head, and Bobby won. So he got to walk away knowing that he had beaten this old group that he had been in charge of, and he stuck with it. He kept talking smack for all 15 years. What was great about Bobby DeGuire is he got to start forming the course. As a pro and as someone who had experience at other golf courses, he took what he saw in Appleton that worked well and brought it here. And he constantly pushed his own golf abilities, constantly outplaying on the course, joining with random members. He set the first course record. Of course, at the time, if you did 18 holes, you just did the 9 holes twice. But he set the first record for 65 in 1928. The next year, he broke his own record and went down to 64. And in 1931, in a round of just 9, he was able to do 30, which was pretty impressive. At the time, for 18, par was 72, which is interesting because par right now is 72 as well. So I guess some things don't change. But there were changes both to the course, the clubhouse, the staff. Everything adjusts over those early decades. So the first year we actually opened with 8 holes instead of 9. The hole number 6 was what is along that waterfront area, and because that was so marshy and the Isaac Walton League was building that trout rearing pond, they actually opened just with 8. Once they were able to open hole number 6 and go up to 9, they decided to renovate and change the clubhouse. The original clubhouse was a family farmhouse that was here on the property, and when it was moved over, they actually split a wing off of the building, and that wing turned into a tool shed or a maintenance area. The main house came over, and where it had been was turned into sand traps. Later, after that clubhouse had been moved, in 1929 they planted 1,000 more trees around the course. In 1930 they installed the first sprinkler system here with 20 sprinklers across. But if you compare that to today, I've been told we have between 1,200 and 1,500 sprinkler heads now. So we'll see how much of a difference those 20 sprinklers made. In 1938, there was a donation of 12,000 tree saplings to be planted out here. So we had a huge planting party. And later, in 1965 is when finally that second 9 was built. It took about 40 years to get there, but you needed the push and you needed the funding and the interest. Once they had that second 9 built, you can see that the club got a lot of renewed interest because just a few years later, the clubhouse was remodeled again, and in 1973, the pro shop was remodeled so that it was larger and easier to navigate. Throughout all of this, you had club pros sort of overseeing the connection of the course to the people playing. Bobby DeGuire was that first course pro, and he was someone who worked year-round. So when he was not here teaching, golf or golfing out with groups. He would teach indoors over winter, he held special events, and he also trained other people who wanted to be pros. Charlie Carr came a decade later. So for 10 years here, there was no pro. They couldn't find someone to fill Bobby's shoes. But after Charlie moved on, Ed Landine, Daryl Acker, and then Doug Bisbee all moved in. So these were the names that were overseeing some of the largest course changes that we saw. In case you haven't seen some of the photos of those clubhouse changes when we saw the renovations going on, first I have two photos from 1953. So first we have the mayor of Stevens Point, who is placing the mortar for the cornerstone. 1953 is when we saw a full remodel. And once the members saw the full remodel, they said, this is fine, but it's not pretty. So we need it to be pretty. So there was another remodel about 15 years later, 1969, and with that remodel, they particularly pushed to bring back what they called like old English wood. They wanted dark woods, they wanted teak, they wanted very nice fixings that they thought fit a country club better than what they had gotten in 1953. Some of the women's groups held rummage sales or fundraisers to help get that money in, and the end result was really exciting for everybody. But that was also around the time that we were, of course, adding that second 9. So if you've not gotten a chance to see what that looked like, because there's certainly been some changes, this is what that second 9 looked like once we started. So 1965, here in the center is where you would enter, and of course, in that center there is sort of where the clubhouse is. 1 starts exactly where it does today, so that's not too crazy. And same with 10, but you'll have noticed some shifts, especially around the outside of the course. Every year it feels like something changes out here, whether it's sand traps, greens getting shortened, tee boxes changing. So this was just one expansion for us. And of course, when you have a big expansion, it's great to bring back some of the original people to see it. So in 1965, the Stevens Point Journal got a photo of 4 veteran members of the country club. They were ones who had organized the club to start, and they got to come back and play this new course. So you had Melvin Krause, A.J. Sherrill, Ted Reed, and Herman Menzel. Herman Menzel particularly went out and won quite a few tournaments. He was someone we sent to traveling tournaments, and he got some of our junior records here in the first few years. So bringing back some of these founding members was fantastic. They helped plant trees that were cut down to make the next 9, so hopefully they didn't feel too bad about it. Of course, it was great to also see that the Stevens Point Journal pointed out that nothing could have been done here without the maintenance staff. Back when the Isaac Walton League was out here, they would get volunteers to come take care of the trout pond and take care of the waterways. But when it came to things like the sand traps or the greens, it was up to your caddies, it was up to your golf pro, and it was up to eventually the maintenance men who were coming around and making sure things were working. Now, later, we really start to see bigger and bigger tournaments, either taking Stevens Point Country Club members out to tour, or luckily, we got to host quite a few here as well. So in just one photo here from 1967, we have that current golf pro, Doug Bisbee, presenting a traveling trophy to Leo Cordes, winners of a tournament that had come out here. And in 1969, we have a photo of 3 winners of a women's tournament. Now, there's so much tournament history that, like I said before, keep an eye out on our PCHS website because we're going to be doing a blog post focusing more on the tournaments and especially the women's side of history out here as well. Now, 1970 was another one of those years that we mentioned of having clubhouse renewal. So in these photos, you can see what the people in charge of the Stevens Point Country Club had wanted to highlight. In that first top photo, they had wanted to point out that they now had an outdoor patio and deck. Beforehand, they had a large screened-in porch, but they didn't have something that was more outdoors. This was also the expansion that gave us the covered carport that's out front. Before then, if it's raining, it's raining. You just gotta go through it. And this was one of the major expansions to this dining area and bar. At this point, the club could hold up to 200 people here for dining, which was considered a really sizable spot. And if you were a member, you were able to rent it for parties or weddings. So around this time, you started seeing a lot of family reunions and weddings held out here as well. More expansions, of course, happened on the course, but inside. In 1973 is when that pro shop was expanded, revitalized, and the current golf members mentioned that it was much easier to navigate with new lights. Made me wonder how dark it was in there to start. Now there were some changes that were tried out that didn't stay, right? You might try putting out a new putting green or try putting out a sand trap that's so terrible you just have to change it the next year. But sometimes we do that with technology as well. So in 1973, Doug Bisbee, that pro, wanted to try bringing out some new technology to the course. He thought, you know, we're living in the future. It's 1973, right? So he brought out Maynard, the new electronic caddy. He had a little remote in his hand that allowed him to call this caddy over to him. However, as they point out in the photo, he's sort of holding his golf club out like he's ready for it to ram him and he needs to be ready to fend it off. Sadly, these did not stick around very long. If anyone has seen one in a storage room around here, I'd love to try it, but these were not a hit. People did not want to rent them. Instead, the classic golf cart was much preferred. Now, when we're thinking about from even just 50 years ago to now, there's still been so many course changes, tournaments out here, members joining, and families making memories out here. We built a pool out here in the 1950s that was actually built before the city pool was built in Gerke Park. In fact, they used the argument that since there was a pool here, there would be less stress if you built a community pool because people were already going here anyway, so that one won't get overpopulated. You also had other groups able to come out here and use the course, whether for outings or to sponsor championships. We still have businesses that have their own leagues or their own teams that participate. Membership has also changed over the years. Starting back in 1928, membership was only available to stockholders. Stock was originally $100 a share, but went up to $125 at the end of the year. If you had stock, then you could pay $40 for membership. So you sort of had to unlock it first. But after a few years, they decided to unlock the stockholder requirement and just have paid membership. So those first dues in 1928 were $30. If your wife wanted to join, that was another $10, and same if you had a child or two. In 1929, that went up to $40, and later in 1932, once they opened the course to the public, they were able to offer different groupings so that if you, say, were a woman without a husband, you could also golf out here, which is nice. The golf pros have continued to oversee some great changes to the course and have seen through the really awkward stage in the 1980s when Century opened, and there was this big question of what would happen to the country club. So thankfully, we have seen that the community was not going to jump. But at the time, there was a lot of fear about that, and that's actually why the club pro, Doug Bisbee, had left. He said he was fearing that his job was going to not exist, and so he went to another country club at that point. But we found more people to come in, we found more people who wanted to support this club, and it really paid off. Now, you will find that membership here has also changed with those costs, especially having to be a stockholder to start. When they first started here in 1927, there were 150 members, and they were, of course, all stockholders. Later, in 1935, you were up to 196 members. By 1967, it was up to 250, so it felt very slow. But thankfully, that also has continued to grow. This year, there are 1,540 members here at the country club. That includes, of course, all the different variety of member packages here. But being able to continue expanding any of these types of memberships has been what allows us to feed into the course and keep these changes updating. Now, like I mentioned before, there's been so many tournaments and so many groups out here, and we're going to be covering that later in a blog article because there's just too much to cover in one talk. But if you have memories of this course, I highly recommend that you share them as well. This is your chance to share something for people who were not here when you were, or your chance to record those memories for posterity when we hit 200 years here. As you're thinking about the Stevens Point Country Club today, I hope you remember the legacy of the people who fought for us to have a club here, the ones who fought through all the uncertainties of expanding and constantly pledging money, hoping that it would turn out. And I hope you think to the positive future we have ahead. Thank you so much for coming out.
So what I've been doing for the last 2 years, I've been solving so if someone can't make it, I call. So far this year.
Gotta get on the list. You're so good. You want to see your